Welcome. We are live. This is the 50th web talk from ELAAD we're doing. Most of these web talks have been in Dutch, but some in English. So warm welcome to all our Dutch, but also our international viewers. My name is Erik van Kaathoven. I work at ELAAD as a communications manager. And ELAAD is the Knowledge and Innovation Center on the smart and sustainable charging of electric vehicles. And we are an initiative of the joint Dutch grid operators. As I told you, this is the 50th web talk we do. The first one we did on the 3rd of September back in 2020. We started in the middle of the Corona pandemic, and we continued after that. There appeared to be a need to share knowledge about research in the field of EVs and EV charging. Many topics and experts have already passed in this webinar. For example, about electric cars, solar cars, electric vans, trucks, e-trucks, and even planes and boats. Smart charging in all kinds of different ways and tests, power quality and V2G, vehicle to grid, but also cybersecurity, AE, behavioral science research, wireless charging, protecting in the charging in the event of a lightning strike, charging at lamp posts, smart charging plazas, open standards, and so on. And many thanks to all experts who gave their presentation here. And the great thing is you can watch all of them still on YouTube. Our 50th web talk is going to be a special one. We invite back Auke Hoekstra, EV expert at the Technical University of Eindhoven. Welcome, Auke.
Thank you.
Auke has already presented here about how electric cars can save even more CO2 than expected, and about electric trucks. And today he's going to do what most of you know him for on social media, debunking the myths surrounding electric vehicles and charging. You can put your questions in the question box. This web talk will also be recorded and be available on YouTube later this afternoon. So let's start with this debunking session by Auke. Auke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erik. That's the third time, right? Yeah, nice. It's going to be a little bit less, a little bit different from normal because it's also going to be about good times. One moment. Iris, don't make noise, please. That's my wife making a lot of noise in the kitchen, for me at least. But it's going to be a little bit special because I'm going to think about old times and about how it was to do all this debunking, not just about the facts. And the first thing I want to start with is a debunk I did in The Guardian of something that was written in The Guardian, because it eventually led to how do you call that, a publication, and because there was a lot of hubbub about it. And this was basically an opinion piece. First debunk I'm going to talk about by Hans Werner Zinn, where he claimed electric vehicles produce more CO2 than diesel. And yeah, I think I was one of the people who really cut that off at the knees. And I actually reacted to this long before he wrote the opinion piece. I actually wrote about it about 6 months in advance. One moment, please. Zie je dus? Ik kan je echt dat heel goed horen. Niet doen. Ik ben nu live, gewoon even heel stil. Sorry. So what I did was take an afternoon and do this debunk, and this was 6 months before he wrote the opinion. And it worked very well. A lot of outlets picked it up, and they also named me, which was very good for my ego. And in the end, I said, how often do I have to do this? Because now The Guardian, even the Guardian, my beloved Guardian, is repeating this. Fortunately, the Guardian is a good newspaper, also printed a response by my good friend William Todds, who explained very clearly that this was nonsense. So if you go to the article now, you can see that it's nonsense. But I want to tell you what I did with it. I wrote an article. I was invited actually to write an article about why do people always make such big mistakes when they calculate the CO2 emissions of electric vehicles. And now it's sort of part of the peer-reviewed literature, so it's much more accessible also for scientific purposes. And I basically pointed out there that this publication, which was driven by Hans Werner Zinn, who is very famous, but the first author was a gentleman called Buchal, that they said there's a diesel car emitted 170 grams, and I showed no, you're making all kind of errors. It's actually 240 grams. And I said the electric vehicle, you claim it's emitting between 189 and 214 grams. Actually, it's just 95 grams. So how did I do that? Well, basically, I, as I show in the scientific article also, you can find it there. Don't overestimate battery manufacturing, because it's right now 75 kilograms CO2 per kilowatt hour and falling. Many people still say it's like 200 kilograms or something. It's really nonsense. Then please don't stop underestimating battery life. It's not that you have to replace it during the lifetime of the car. It's rather much longer right now than the lifetime of the car. Don't assume that the electricity mix will not change. A lot of people do that. I'm very proud that this is, I think, an innovation that a lot of people took from me, that if you look over the lifetime of a vehicle, you have to include the fact that over the lifetime of the vehicle, electricity mix also changes. Then using unrealistic tests for energy use, I've written a lot about how I hate the fact that in the European Union, politics and electric vehicle manufacturers are so much intertwined that somehow all these measurements are really bad. So basically, you pay the measuring instance to make your measurements look as good as you can in Europe, where, for example, in the United States, they have an adversarial relationship. So there, you can really have an organization that is impartial and that is trying to be exact. It's a really big difference. It's like 20% difference at the moment. It used to be 40, 50%. I think this 20% is going up at the moment, this 20% nonsensical markup for political shenanigans. Then excluding fuel production. Actually, this was the one thing that Hans Werner Zinn did right. He added those, but a lot of people forget it. And then there's a sort of a lack of system thinking, like, okay, maybe diesel is better now. It isn't, right? It's like it has like 3 times more CO2 emissions. But imagine you were right and it was like 3 times more CO2 emissions. Then still in 10 years, it will be very, very different, right? But I want to look at one thing because I love it so much, because it actually made me famous on Twitter long before I started doing this debunk. And that is, this point of grid gets cleaner. Many of people watching this will probably know this graph. What you see here, the thick black line, is how every year more solar panels are produced and placed on roofs and in the fields and whatever, right? This is a very, very steep increase, right? And what you see is that the International Energy Agency, but it's also true for the Energy Intelligence Agency, the AEA in America, and for many others, that this is more or less horizontal. And you see that even if you update it, because I haven't updated it for a while, this last time I updated this was in 2018, Even if you update it, then it's still going on the same way. See? I also did a lot of research into what that meant. For example, by contributing to an article about 100% renewable energy systems. And this is one thing I'm super proud of. It's silly. By the way, I never got an euro of money from Tesla or any special favors or whatever, but I do like the fact that they produce a lot of electric vehicles. And Martin Viga, who works there, is, I don't know how you pronounce his name, actually, I've never met him, I think, or at least on in person. But he said that in our impact report, so Tesla impact report, we took a lot of stuff from Auke. And yeah, that was like, wow, not just on Twitter, people are listening, but also here by Tesla and maybe, I know for Volkswagen that once Herbert D said he's doing good stuff, they are listening. Then the next thing. So I did was CO2, and I did like tons of stuff on CO2, but I thought it was kind of boring to go through all of it. Believe me, at the moment, electric vehicle emits about 1/3. If you want proof, look at my pinned thread. Let's go on to something else, and that is hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is a good way to drive a vehicle, right? It works very fine. Here you see two pictures. On the left, you see an electric vehicle, very large battery. See it here. If you have a fuel cell vehicle, you have a very small battery here in the back. You have two. Before that, you have two tanks for the hydrogen. These tanks are really lightweight compared to the battery, but they're a lot bigger. In this case, they were actually very nice to hydrogen. By making them very small, they are in actuality they are much bigger than the battery. And then you have the fuel cells that turn the hydrogen into electricity again. Many people of you know I'm not a fan of this, and why is that? Well, basically this is the reason. If you use hydrogen, you have to take renewable electricity, you turn it into hydrogen, and then use fuel cells to take it from hydrogen into renewable electricity. And that is a very inefficient process. So I always love to use this illustration of my good friend Michael Liebreich, who said in 2004, people predicted how many hydrogen vehicles there would be in 2020. And this is what they predicted. 5 million here, 5 million here, and 2.5 million here. Guess what happened in actuality? This happened. A lot less than they expected. You can also graph it this way. This is the sales of electric vehicles, up to 2020 in this case. And this is the sales of hydrogen vehicles. They don't make it out of the onto the first pixel, basically. And the reason is very simple, I think. The cost will never work out because this going from electricity to hydrogen and back, it simply takes a lot of extra equipment, and it takes a lot of extra hassle, and it takes twice the amount of energy. I don't know, maybe if we get a pipeline from the Sahara to here, and they have lots of super cheap solar there, it could theoretically work. I don't see it happening. So we get back to what I showed you in the beginning. I said I was going to talk about debunk. I just explained to you why hydrogen doesn't work. But a lot of times people still try to make it work, and they try to say, yeah, but it emits less CO2. And that always annoys me no end, because they have to do all kind of tricks to get that. So this is a graph I made. What you see on the left side of every duo of bars is the bar that was originally produced by Fraunhofer in this study that was paid for by the hydrogen industry. And on the right side, you always see what I made of it after some adjustments. And the adjustments I made basically were, the largest adjustment I made was saying, look, you cannot say that the electric vehicle runs on electricity that contains lots of carbon per kilowatt hour, and that the fuel cell, fuel cell electric vehicle runs on much less carbon emitting electricity. They do that all the time, and it's just not fair, right? I mean, you cannot say my fuel cell vehicle runs on wind and your electric vehicle runs on solar, which I dictate is emitting 4 times as much, or it runs on basically coal, because in this study they assumed 800 grams per kilowatt hour for the average mix, which is complete nonsense even in Germany. So for that reason, if you change things around, you immediately go on the average mix from a lot of emissions, this time 250 grams per kilowatt hour. In this study, 200 grams. Then this one, next one. So we had hydrogen, just a nice example of hydrogen, pretty popular debunk at the time. I love this one also for the picture it produced this way. But there's this professor basically saying the whole electricity grid will have to be overturned and have to be replaced if we start with those electric vehicles. Well, apart from the fact that we're probably going to have to replace it anyway when we start with lots of solar and wind and other more renewable solutions, it's not true. So this is what he said. And I'm like, oh, not again. So what did he use to make this statement work for him? He's a physicist, and you know, physicists, they can calculate very well, but they don't care so much about being realistic or something. It's just the input to their calculation is often simply not important to them, and then they start calculating, some of them at least. And in this case, he said, well, let's assume they can charge at 7 kilowatts, and let's assume they do it for 8 hours. Well, that's enough to drive 200 miles. And the average car only uses 20 or 30 miles. That actually is less. So this 20 or 30 miles is already quite extensive. So yeah, you charge 10 times less, and you can just throw this complete newspaper piece out of the window. That's where it starts. But it becomes even more interesting. And this picture will be known by the guys at ELAAD. As you can see, he's wearing an ELAAD jacket. Because ELAAD does a lot of research into so-called smart charging. And that means that you charge the vehicle at the time when the electricity is cheapest and greenest, instead of at the time when you plug it in. Because you usually plug it in at the moment when there's also peak demand for electricity, when you come home in the evening. So what smart charging does basically is say, look at this, your car is still half full. Most cars, like 70% of them, will still be half full. You can wait a couple of hours before we start charging. Your charge will be much cheaper then, and the electricity grid will have no problems whatsoever. I started to research that here at ELAAD, actually. I was working for ELAAD in the past, and they launched the career you're seeing me on now. And it might be a little bit of overkill, but after ELAAD, I really wanted to find out what the interaction was between mobility and the electricity grid. So I started this rather large research initiative to find out. And for example, we make calculations like this, where the entire Netherlands is simulated. And let me see. What you see here is, for me, it's running very slowly. Maybe it's not working. What you should be seeing here is a nice movie that shows how energy is, for me it's not working, how energy is advancing over the day. And you can change the entire electricity grid. You can change all the inputs. and you can look at what it does with the outputs over time. And this really gives you a good impression of where to look out for, and for example, what the impact will be of electric vehicles. We also do it at the neighborhood level. And let's go to the next slide, because there was a point I wanted to make. What you do then is, what you get is graphs like this, where we say, look, imagine that 50% of electricity came from renewable electricity, like lots of solar and wind. And imagine that 20% of households have an electric vehicle. Then if you do stupid charging, you really see peaks here going up at the end of the day. Also at the beginning of the day, but less important, because the electricity grid is always just interested in the peak. One peak, that's where you build everything for. You see here, really large peak, and it's only 20% of the people having an EV. But if you do smart charging, you can basically direct the peak anywhere you like. In this case, it was optimized for being cheap. If we would optimize it for taking the grid into account maximally, we could completely flatten it away. So this whole point of electric vehicles, they overturn the grid. Now it's the other way around. Actually, what we hope, what we see at the moment, is because electric batteries basically can do so many cycles before they're written off. Producers are getting more and more interested in so-called vehicle-to-grid or bidirectional charging, where you can basically plug in your electric vehicle at the end of the day, and it will say, oh, you're still half full or three-quarter full. You know what? We're going to unload you. We're going to put electricity back in the grid. That way we will lower actually this peak, and we will suck up any additional solar and wind that is maybe a little bit problematic and would otherwise be curtailed. And then on a more convenient moment, you will give it back to the grid. So this is actually, I really honestly believe, the future. But what I can promise you is that smart charging will be the future. And then there's this. That's the fourth myth. And I asked people, what do you think is the biggest problem here? Agriculture or mining for nature? Because there was this guy, a researcher called Michaud, who said, oh, it's going to be such a big problem to have all this mining, and all this mining is to increase in really unrealistic proportions if we want to do 100% renewables. So based on that alone, we can forget all these pipe dreams about electrifying everything. And of course, I took exception to that. So let's talk about that. I came from a completely different direction. When I read his, he was certainly, all of a sudden he was everywhere. But when I read this, I had just read another article which tried to warn people for the problems of mining, but also pointed out that out of this writing, it only took 0.05% of the Earth's habitable land. And I thought, wow, that's 1,000 times less than what we use for agriculture. I mean, it's dirtier, and I also like to look at plants growing, etc., and crops growing more. Then I like to look at a mining pit. Don't get me wrong, but 1,000 times difference. My God. Later, it turned out that they were slightly conservative, so in an update, it was twice as much, but still 500 times less. Wow. And this was with a 5-kilometer perimeter around any pit that was caused by a mine. So I started pointing out to people that, look, this is what we take out of the earth in total. There's lots of biomass we take out. There's lots of often gravel and that sort of stuff we take out. We take out lots of fossil fuels. We take out a lot of metal too, although a lot less than the other stuff. But yeah, actually lithium, for example, all the battery materials, they're very small here. The next slide shows that even more clearly, although that just gives you, this gives you everything that's taken out of the earth, so to speak, including the stones that you in the end cannot use. This takes just the metal. And here you can see, for example, lithium, where everybody's talking about lithium, lithium, lithium. It's very hard to see here. It's 100,000 tons against, it's really insignificant. So yeah, I understand that we have to mine sustainably, but come on. And then we get back to Michaud, because someone on the internet, if you watch my pinned thread, you can find him, was helpful enough to put the numbers in an Excel sheet, so I didn't have to do it. And it said, look, if you go for 100% renewable energy system, then Bloomberg New Energy Finance imagines you need about this much energy storage. And there's others like the IEA who expect this much. But here is Michaud with his first and second study. The difference is so large as to be, it's not even funny anymore. Problem turned out, he took 10 weeks of battery storage. That's what no sane energy modeler would ever do. If you need long-term storage, you use biofuels, you use maybe gas in the beginning, and in the end you use hydrogen, you use chemical storage. You sure as hell don't use batteries. And moreover, you don't use the most expensive and most precious lithium batteries. As I said, I wrote about 100% renewable energy systems. I knew a little bit about it. And I asked my good friend Christian Breyer, what do you think? And he said, oh my God, not him again. Really like that. We've debunked him so many times. He's not even peer-reviewed literature, but he just keeps popping up with this nonsense report. No, it's not 10 weeks, it's 5 hours. And I do this for entire energy system with all the energy in it. So I go for 5 hours and I say that's 150 times less. And I also say, don't use nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries. This is the most expensive, most lightweight, most super duper batteries that you use in the Teslas, etc., in high-end electric cars. But you will use at least lithium iron phosphate, which is a cheaper variant of lithium batteries. It's a little bit more heavy. And yeah, you could even use flow batteries, so for stationary batteries. So 10 weeks of NMC is out of this world, is idiocy. Then about how many land does it take to do renewable stuff? Because okay, maybe the mining doesn't take a lot of area, and the electric vehicles are okay by themselves, but we still have to give them energy, right? How much land surface does that take? Usually we say about a maximum of 0.3% of habitable land. If we do it cleverly and also use wind at sea, etc., it's probably going to be, and if we mix solar and wind a little bit, it's probably be closer to 0.1% of surface. And here you see a visualization of how much land we would have to give to renewables. So that was that. But it keeps popping up. This is another example where even Elon Musk all of a sudden was in my timeline saying, the Guardian is broken after I pointed out that lithium use was 1,000 times too high in an article. Fortunately, the Guardian, again, corrected. Say what you want, I've had a couple of run-ins now with the Guardian, they always correct. So yeah, minerals, please, if somebody tells you they're a big problem, refer them to my pinned thread. This is also a nice way to visualize it. Every container takes 1 gigaton. It's a lot of material, I have to admit that. Out of the earth every year. This is visualized here. Every truck represents 1 gigaton every year. And here you see all the stuff we have to take out for fossil fuels. Now, if we went to 100% renewable energy system, this would be the end result. Only the trucks here would be left. And after we start recycling, this becomes like half a truck or something. Half a truck, this is the rest. Don't tell me that renewable energy systems cause too much material and minimal use, please. Another way to visualize it, this is the amount of resources we've already found. We know we can dig up. We know where to find it. Relative to what we need for 100% renewable energy system. As you can see, nickel and lithium are the most problematic, but they're still below 30% of what we already know where to find. And more interestingly, people think that as we dig up more, we are left with less. But actually, for example, in the case of lithium, as we dig up more, we start looking for more and we find more. So the amount of lithium, you see that on the right-hand side, is actually going up super steeply since we need more. And actually, if you say, I want to know the amount of years we can still mine, for example, lithium, and compare now, for example, with 10 years back and 20 years back, then we always have roughly like 200 years of lithium to mine still. So really, please believe me, no problem. And then we get Aston Gate, the last one. Aston Gate was, in terms of CO2 emission debunking, a bit lightweight. Even the inputs they used, the companies they ripped off numbers from, said, "What the hell are you doing?" So I did my usual routine. I very quickly pointed out. Okay, let me back up a little bit. The problem. You know what? Let me explain it using Wikipedia, because Aston Gate made it to Wikipedia. So the problem was that Aston Martin, Bosch, and a couple of other firms were very unhappy with the fact that Boris Johnson and his government were going to ban electric vehicles, or ban combustion vehicles in the far future. And they wanted to throw some sand in the machine with using basically bad numbers. And what happened then is that after I pointed this out, my friend Michael Liebreich started digging around a little bit. And what he found was that the communications firm that produced the brochure presented as a new and eye-opening study, that this lady was actually married to the PR manager of Aston Martin. And furthermore, that she seemed to be working as a nurse and not as a PR manager. So it was pretty obvious that this was an attempt to hide that everything was produced and paid for by Aston Martin. And yeah, when that juicy information surfaced, a lot of people jumped onto the bandwagon. I already showed you quickly this slide. But this was just one example of, there was like dozens of outlets who picked it up. And that was very gratifying to stomp out this attempt to discredit the electric vehicle. So I even, it was one of the reasons I did a podcast with my friend Michael Liebreich. And the nice story here is that this podcast led to, I'm not going to name him, I don't know if he wants it, but led to a very, very, very good PhD student joining Neon Research. So that alone was more or less worth it. When I did this podcast, he viewed it and said, "Hey, I'd like to join this club, this Neon Club." But quickly, one bonus. I'll do it very quickly because We've talked about vehicles all the time, but of course the reason we worry about vehicles is because of the climate. And this is one of the things that gives me hope. This article basically shows that we've gone from very bad scenarios to less bad scenarios in climate. And yeah, that's still not good, but it's less bad, and that's nice. And the reason this article, very nice article, was written was because of a Twitter discussion. And Michael Liebreich, that you just saw, he was, again, the one who started it. Kudos. But I was also involved a little bit. These were the people who were mostly involved in that discussion in order of how much tweets they posted or how much people reacted to them. I don't know, I remember that. But it really took me 1 month of my life where I obsessively tried to reverse engineer all the claims and counterclaims about the worst case scenario that the IPCC is using all the time. And my conclusion was, what? This is simply implausible. The Twitter handle was RCP 8.5 is bollocks. And it also led to me meeting a very interesting and courageous PhD who basically pointed this out while he was in his PhD thesis. And he said his life became very hard because he pointed it out so clearly. But it also shows that, yeah, with your PhD thesis, you can make a lot of difference. In a nutshell, this worst case scenario says we will burn 6 times more coal per capita in 2100. And if you see how fast coal plants are closing now, but also if you see just how much coal there is in the world, this is utter nonsense. This is really not possible. So what you get is climate scientists push this because it gives nice large numbers and it makes your paper be noticed, and it's easy to calculate in your models because they react a lot. The media loves it because it's basically climate porn for them. You can say, oh, polar bears will be gone very soon, new study says, using this highly implausible scenario. And the energy community, they hate it. They say 6 times more coal per person. How can you even think of that? What's wrong with you? So super interesting discussion. I really think that Twitter set the tone that sort of changed the whole discussion. And then when Ziek Hausvader and Glenn Peters came out with a Nature article, I think right now, at least everybody says this is a high scenario, a very high scenario, and most people know they should call it an improbable or even implausible scenario. So that gives me hope, and that brings me to my conclusions. So we have still a couple of minutes for questions. EVs are not perfect. Biking is better. I never said EVs are perfect. I never said everybody should get a large car. But they are definitely much better for the environment. So please stop denying that. Second conclusion, it's really heartening to see that it works if you speak out and if you research things well. People do listen. Even if you're not powerful, if your arguments are good, people do listen. But it takes a lot of work and patience, and you really have to get your facts straight. And third of all, and I think that's most important, especially for young people who sometimes lack hope and think everything is going to hell in a handbasket, there is hope, and we can still fix this. And with that, I would say thank you. And if there are any questions, I would love to have them.
Well, thank you, Auke, for your presentation and also the inspiring last words, also for the youth. So we have questions coming in, of course. one personal question for me is how did you even get started debunking EV myths? A lot of people see things and then just go on with their lives, but you started debunking them.
Yeah, I think it's I want to find how I can stop sharing my screen, but I forgot how to do it.
Yeah, that's all right. You stopped it
Okay.
already. Yeah,
Okay,
we
that's
are
great.
both in the picture now.
Great. Yeah, I'm a little bit unhandy that way. So I started basically, I think, a little bit OCD, like, this is not right. I just spent months making very specific sums, and I know this is not correct. Somebody should say something about it. If nobody else does, I will. So I think it simply started like that.
Yeah, and will you also continue doing this, or is this a hobby
I
you
think
want to quit?
it's part of my mental makeup that I have to do this. On the other hand, I get busier and busier all the time with super interesting stuff. But what I really like, by the way, at the moment, that people point out to me like, this one's bad, say something about it. And that sort of
We
saves
need
me the
Auke
time.
here.
And that
We
saves me
need
the
a
time
debug.
of keeping track of everything.
Okay, thank you. And so, um, have you ever had things stories so far-fetched that you didn't even bother debunking it?
Perpetuum mobiles all the time. It's really, yeah, come on. But yeah, there's lots of really crazy stories. But fortunately, actually, there's many crazy stories don't get much traction. I mean, in energy, Twitter is a really nice place. We don't have any QAnon or stuff like that. It's still pretty okay, I would say.
Okay, that's a good thing to know. So from the incoming questions, Michel Anning, he asked three myths. Perhaps you can also debunk two of them we already talked about, but the third one is e-fuels, that they are a good alternative for battery electric cars.
Well, they must be, because the European Union just agreed that if you drive on e-fuels,
They did.
you can keep using your combustion engine in 2035. And I find it so sad, so sad. I just showed a picture in which you saw that the efficiency of e-fuels is half the efficiency of hydrogen, which is half the efficiency of direct battery electric driving. And yeah, no chance in hell that will ever be a thing for cars. Maybe for planes, but for cars, it's just a pipe dream of people who would really like to keep producing combustion engines. And it's very unfortunate that such pipe dream thinkers can basically create so much problems in the European Union. But that's my opinion.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So Alba Arensen has a question. Sure, hydrogen is less efficient than the battery electric vehicle, but would hydrogen not be a good option for large trucks?
Yeah, well, I've done tons of research, no pun intended, on that in the last few years, as you know. I even gave a talk about it here
Yes,
on Elaad. To cut a long story short, if the range you have to travel before you can refuel is really long, for example, because you're an international trucker and there is no fast charging infrastructure available in Europe, only at your home location maybe or whatever, and if space is not a problem, but weight is, then hydrogen could be a good option, even though it would be a lot more expensive. So I often estimate that maybe in 10% of heavy trucks, it might be a good idea. That's what I think. We don't know anything for sure yet, because a lot of stuff still has to be developed, also price-wise.
okay, thank you. So Frans Meulendijk says he is studying the possibility of using EVs in his garage company, but have to deal with a lot of emotional complaints and wrong details. So why not produce a small paper with the real facts? It's an idea.
Because I'm really busy, but I do agree, because I mean, the facts in this case are electric vehicles, if they burn very hot and they burn very long. And worst case, they could even lead to, for example, some metal in the concrete being melted, and then maybe that can lead to very large, how you say it, costs. But this never ever happens, I think. And the nice thing is, it doesn't explode. It starts up a little bit slower. So I think by now, every time an electric vehicle started to burn, and this happens a lot less with electric vehicles per kilometer than with normal vehicles, even in those cases, people basically still could get out, or it happened when they were not in the garage. So it's simply, if you're afraid to basically get burned alive, be afraid of gasoline vehicles, not of electric vehicles. That would be my message.
Yeah, his question was
it's not a paper, it's
specific.
a paper.
It was all kind of myths, and to have a little.
Yeah, and what you see now is that it basically, as we know batteries better, as the technology becomes more mature, they turn into flames less and less and less and less and less. So in the future, if you're worried about that, well, you have to have a garage with only electric vehicles. Clear.
Yeah. Another question is from Daniel Plus. He says, on nuclear power, can you please comment on that? Both stop closing down existing nuclear power plants, and if there are any needs to construct new nuclear plants as a way to provide energy for the electric cars.
Yeah, I'm not against it. Especially existing nuclear, I think we should try to, it's my personal opinion this, right? But we should try to keep open nuclear power plants until we've closed the coal-fired power plants, at least. And then we can close maybe the nuclear power plants. I think people say that everybody's afraid of them. I think they're not that afraid of them anymore. There is proliferation risk. I mean, every country that has a couple of nuclear power plants could, if they wanted to, probably make a bomb. It doesn't work that well, the whole international controlling them, etc. See Iran. But I think it's largely a little bit overblown compared to how much problems we have with climate. My big problem with nuclear power plants is very simple: expensive and slow. If I want it, I have to wait many years before I have it, and it's very expensive to build. But if you manage to find a Korean firm to quickly build it in your backyard, you won't find me against it.
Okay, well, thank you. Another one by Rennie Schipper. Schipper, when you say there's 200 years of lithium mining left, do you take into account the entirety of the world's vehicles being replaced by electric vehicles?
Yeah. So what actually this question is logically incorrect, in the sense that I was just saying always 200 years in the future at the current mining rate. So comparing the total amount of lithium we have to the total amount of electric cars is a different comparison. And what we see there is that I think with the current lithium resources, we could electrify twice or so all cars in the world. But we know there's probably about 10 times or 100 times more. So we'll manage. And by the way, in the ocean, there's ways to sort of filter the water and get the lithium from that. At the moment, it's still too expensive, but not like it's going to be uncommercial forever. It's probably going to be commercial in a couple of years, at least some researchers say. And that has 5,000 more times lithium that's in the earth. So lithium is really, really, really not a long-term problem. Still, apart from the fact that sodium batteries are now super popular.
Okay, we're getting to one of the last. There are more questions, but we cannot answer them all in this time frame. But this one is also very interesting, I guess. What about this one is from Alexis Fisher. What about the global availability of raw materials for battery electric vehicles? Will we stay highly dependent on China, or do you see other better options for the future?
Yeah. I think that's up to us. Right now, we're largely depending on China because they do it cheapest and because they do it, and we are afraid that if we do it ourselves, it might be more expensive and it might be problematic. So it's basically laziness that we don't do it ourselves. Also very important, we're much more dependent on the ability for China to turn raw materials into halffabrikaten, what you call in English, into basically the inputs that turn the raw materials into inputs for the batteries, to refine them a little more. And these kind of factories are actually very easy to build, but they're sometimes dirty. It's basically low value, low added value work. So I think it's a bit of a non-issue, because it's basically because we don't want to pay even a few percent extra. But it would be a good idea to make ourselves less dependable. Still, one thing I want to point out, I know you're still of time, but if the flow of, let's say, lithium from China dries up, right? And if we cannot get another lithium flow very soon, it will take maybe a month or something. What happens? No electric vehicles are built by a certain factory for a month. That's about it. If, for example, oil from, let's say, or gas from, for example, Putin stops flowing for a month, all of a sudden, then we have a problem tomorrow. So it's a really fossil fuels and materials, you cannot compare them one-on-one. It's in terms of how sensitive your economy and your safety is, minerals are a lot safer. Just like the batteries that we said, you can get out before they explode. It's electric vehicles should give you a very comfortable and safe feeling.
Okay, I guess that are some good last words for this this time frame we have. I'm sorry for everyone else putting the questions forward, but you can always follow Auke on Twitter and
ask them on Twitter. Append them to the Twitter thread where Elaad says come to this meeting, and I will answer them there. Promise.
Yeah, and we will make this YouTube video, this video available on YouTube later on. Thanks, Auke, again for attending us with the third time. Every time is always a pleasure. And thanks, attendees, for viewing us, watching us, and putting forward questions. The next web talk will be in 2 weeks on the 13th of April. Yeah, we hope to see everyone again that time. That's the same time of the day. So thank you all again, and we'll see you.